Today at ShopDAP.com, we're going to be installing an updated Racingline catch can on this facelift MK7 GTI. Okay, so catch can, first of all, we are working with Racingline on this catch can. We are going to be doing the install on this one, and then we're also going to be giving one away in addition to that. So to win that catch can, all you need to do is comment in the comment section below. We're going to select one random winner. A few weeks ago, we gave away the Racingline MK7 chassis brace made of carbon fiber, and the winner was Adam Baines, so congrats to him for winning that item. Catch cans have a variety of purposes, but essentially what they do is they put this can in between the intake track for where you would recirculate the crank ventilation to the intake of the car. So for emissions reasons, you have to recirculate the crank ventilation back into the intake. In old cars back in the day, it used to just have a tube that would dump out onto the ground, and then it would drip out all the fumes and oil and all that stuff onto the road. That's illegal. You can't do that. So what you do is you put a catch can in place. This will catch it, and this will cause all of that vapor to come through here, pass through, and it will condense. You'll get a bunch of water, some oil, and then some fuel vapors and stuff like that all will end up in this can, which you'll have to drain periodically. Most commonly, the biggest reason why you would want a catch can, especially on MQB stuff, any Mark 7 or really MQB car in general, is because of track use. So under heavy acceleration or lateral force, the factory PCV valve becomes a problem. So you'll see a lot of videos of Mark 7s on tracks blowing out plumes of smoke behind them, and that's because the PCV valve can't hold up. So you would want to install a catch can like this. If you were doing so, there are only a couple that I'm aware of that actually solve the problem of that PCV issue. Racingline is one of them. So if you're looking to track your vehicle, you will want to make sure you're using one that will solve the issue of addressing that if you are under those type of conditions. So some people do stuff like this to get rid of carbon buildup, which is a whole different issue, which we'll link to a video talking about that issue as well. It's not necessarily going to solve that problem, but it will probably have some assistance. But the primary reason would be for tracking and heavy acceleration, lateral acceleration, to prevent any oil blow-by coming through. That is an issue with these engines under those conditions. Let's get into our install. Okay, so we're going to start with this assembly here. We have all the parts that it comes with. The first is going to be the gasket. Now, we actually shot a video on this quite a while ago, and this was a slightly different variation of this, which I believe, I don't know this for sure, but I suspect they redesigned this to hold up to high boost applications, which is why they changed this whole setup here. So the previous one didn't have this exact style and was slightly different here. So we're going to get this gasket mounted all the way around and push down, and then we will proceed with mounting this top plate on. So included with this kit, we have the gasket on, are all the bolts here. You'll see the small bolts are the ones that mount this on. These actually mount the plate to the valve cover or the top of the engine. So this is going to be mounted on after the fact, but first we got to get this on. We have to mount this plate in here. Now, if you look, there's an edge to make this thing sit properly. So when you mount it in there, it sits at an angle, but you want to make sure this is wrong right here, because you'll see it's at the wrong angle. This is the wrong way. This is the wrong way. This is the right way. Now you have that plate mounted in there. Because that thing can move, what I recommend is sitting that upside down and then putting this down upside down on top of it, like so, and then you can flip it back over to get the rest of these threaded in here. Now these screws are 2.5 millimeter Allens, so you will need to make sure you have the appropriate Allens for that, and then these larger ones are 4 millimeters, which are also not super common, so you will need to make sure you have both of those. Okay, now I just have those threaded on, and we're going to mount this piece in place. So this piece mounts right here in this threaded screw, and it comes with washers on it. And then one's for the top, one's for the bottom. They probably just ship them that way so that you don't lose one of them. And then we're going to thread this guy on here. And I'm not going to finalize tightening this until we have the hose mounted on it, just for correct orientation. So I'm just going to get that threaded in. Just make sure you don't go crazy tightening these, because these are 2.5 millimeter Allens, and if you go crazy tightening them, you might strip one and then you'll regret it. You may consider putting some Loctite on the threads of these, just because you're probably not going to be taking this thing on and off most likely ever, but you can throw a little bit of blue Loctite on there to make sure these things stay and engine vibration doesn't rattle them loose. All right, so first we're going to remove this engine cover. Now what that plate we just assembled replaces is the PCV valve. So we're going to remove all these screws that are torque screws that hold this PCV valve in place. And then also there's a screw here that this actually comes out. Most of those are captive with the exception of that one. This is for that pipe that goes back here. So that's going to have to come out of there, and the rest of these are all captive. So we're going to get these loosened up. Okay, now we're going to be taking this hose off here. This is the N80 valve or evap purge valve. And on the original video we shot, the setup was a little bit different than this one. So actually we don't need to take off that side. We take off this side from the PCV valve itself. Now as you can see, we loosened all those bolts. So everything is moving around. But these hose pliers, you will want something like this. You can use regular pliers for these type of clamps, but they can be difficult without them. So we'll link to them in the description where we have those special pliers on our site for spring clamps. Now to remove these hoses, picks are usually, they're not required, but they make your life easier because you can get in between the hose and then kind of just run it around. When a hose has never been off before, it'll often kind of bite onto the nipple, and so you can just run it around like that and it'll help you work it off. This pipe in the back has to be popped off. The screw is off, but it kind of tension fits in. It's got a seal back here. So I'm going to take this flathead screwdriver and kind of pry against this housing and see if we can pop that loose. It's kind of worked its way out there and it's off. Okay, so to remove these coils, we're actually going to remove these grounds first. Now, this is a 10mm wrench that has actually been flattened. It's been ground down for holding on to the bottom of this. Because of the amount of space between these, there's not a lot there, so you'll need to either use a needle nose plier or something like this wrench. We're looking at offering a thin version of this so that you can do this without having to modify your tools, but this particular one is a modified one to prevent that ground from getting torn up during the attempted removal here. Let's pull those grounds off. We can get them out of the way, and then we can just take off these that hold the coils in. Now I'm going to unplug these, which you just kind of push down on this tab and slide it back. And then we're going to get this thing back as far as possible. We may have to unplug these other ones just to give us the space to get the last one unplugged all the way. And see, that's free. So we can pull these out. Now there is a special tool you're going to thread in here, which we also can offer. It's not required, but it is really hard to get your hands down underneath here. There's not a lot to grab onto, and the rubber boot can rip off underneath there. So this special tool, all it does is go into the bolt hole, and then you thread this guy down, it spreads it open, and then you keep tightening it until it's snug, and this gives you something to pull on to remove that coil. Now, older cars had these things that would stick in there, and they were really hard to get out. That's just an FYI. This is a newer car. This is an 18 model, and these coils came out pretty easy. A video we did a long time ago on the 15 GTI, they did not come out very easy at all. Okay, so now our PCV valve should have plenty of freedom here, and wiggle it off there, and we are free. All right, now we're working right here with this PCV pipe. Now, this is open right now, but you kind of want to have it open to give you freedom to move this pipe around. Otherwise, the PCV valve will be in the way. You will maybe want to throw some rags in here to make sure you don't drop anything. There's really nothing to drop, but just in case, it's something maybe a precaution you would like to take. This car does have a blow-off valve on it, so this looks a little bit different than factory, but basically what you're going to do is kind of work this thing off. You're kind of work it up while you twist it back and forth. There's not a great way to remove these, and sometimes they can be real difficult to come off. Okay, so I'm going to loosen this intake pipe just to get a little more clearance on here, because it's not that it's necessarily required, but it is in the way, and this pipe can be difficult to get off. So you get a little more leverage by taking this thing off. It's Pretty simple, just this one 7 or a flathead for this, and then this spring clamp on the other side. And we're gonna take this off. Just pop this out like so, and then pull that off. So because this car had a blow-off valve, I actually popped it off real quick. It's just these 5mm that hold it on, just so I could rotate this a little more to give me a little more play to work with. You can see this gives me a lot more movement with this, and then it comes off a little bit easier when you're able to rotate it. Okay, so now we're gonna throw this hose in here, and all I'm gonna do is get this fed in place. And the reason why I'm doing this now is because when this plate is mounted in place, it's gonna be a little bit tougher to get this routed underneath all of this stuff. So we can get that set in place like this. I'm not gonna snap anything down completely, but I'm gonna get that set in place so that's all set up there. All right, so this gasket we pulled out from that PCV valve. You do have to kind of peel it up, so be careful you don't just yank on it and end up breaking it. You will have to replace it. We'll link to the replacement one in the description in case you need one, in case yours is old. If your vehicle, this car is pretty low mileage, but if you had higher mileage, you might consider replacing it. And I'm just gonna clean this thing up a little bit, get some of the oil residue off, and then we can throw this in place. All right, I'm gonna run my finger around there just to make sure it's sitting down everywhere. Then I'm just gonna wipe it off real quick around the edges just to make sure it's free from as much oil and stuff as possible. And you're all set there. We're just going to mount this back on the valve cover, and we're using these other bolts that were included, which mount to the valve cover. These are the 4mm. All right, we're gonna throw our plate on right here. This hose comes with an extra piece of hose that goes to this side of the N80 valve. So you're gonna slide it on from here to there. Because this isn't really pressure driven, you're not necessarily gonna need clamps, but you can try to reuse these original spring clamps. All right, now we're taking this hose off just to swap this over. And again, pick to work it off, and we had that spring clamp off. And at this point, you would wanna swap these over, and this hose is just gonna be put in place over here. Now, it does come a little bit long, so you can just cut it to the appropriate length and then slide it over there. All right, so we are now ready. We're just gonna drop all these bolts in place. I would recommend threading them by hand before you do anything tightening wise. Okay, so I'm actually gonna be using an adjustable wrench on this. This is for this mounting screw. This, I believe they have some different AN sizes for all these fittings. So if you have AN wrenches, you'll need to use those. That's really what you would want to keep the finish on these as clean as possible. If you don't, you're gonna wanna use an adjustable or something like that. You will wanna make sure that this line right here is not pinched off right here. It is kind of pinched off on our end, so I will have to adjust that orientation. I may actually turn it a little bit further back. I may loosen this a little bit, turn it further back, and then cut this line down a little bit to prevent the kinks as hard. So that's something that you will wanna do, because you will get check engine lights for evap faults, N80 valve evap leak faults and stuff like that if this is not flowing properly. Okay, so now we're gonna be removing this 16mm bolt for the engine mount here, and we're just gonna crack that loose. Okay, so here is our catch can itself. So the lower is in place like so. There is a screw included that mounts right there, and then the engine mount bolt goes back in place here. So we're just gonna throw that guy down, get that mounted in place, and then we'll thread our 16 back on at the bottom. You don't actually worry about the engine coming out of the vehicle, is because all you're doing is loosening this bolt and then tightening it back up, and then the engine mount just sits on top there. And then we're gonna thread the included Torx into this top one here. Okay, so now we have our two lines here. We have our can here, and then we're mounting back there and over here. Now these are rotatable, so these are gonna be in kind of a different orientation. So this one I have mounted in place, and we're gonna get this guy threaded on. Now you gotta be careful when you're threading these on, because if your approach angle is off, you could end up creating some issues with your actual lines, and you could damage the threads. So I'm gonna thread this guy on first. I'm not gonna tighten it down. I'm just going to get it set in place, and then we'll get this one also in. These lines do interfere with a little bit while you're trying to thread them, so you could try, if you're having trouble threading them with one of them first, try swapping it out and doing the other one first. I'm not sure one of them is going to be better than the other because they're both kind of going to be in the way a little bit of each other. But remember, the approach angle that when you thread these things on can make it impossible to thread if you don't have a correct angle. So a good trick to work with when you're trying to get these threaded on is to wiggle it as you're doing it, because any tension created by the angle can be freed up by that. Now we're all set there, and we haven't snugged them down yet, but we can grab our hose clamp that goes in the middle here. Okay, now we're going to mount this clamp, and it is two separate pieces. There's an Allen screw in the middle, 4.5 millimeter, and you just clamp it around and thread this guy in place. Pretty simple, especially when you drop an Allen down in the engine. Okay, so now we're just going to snug this up. I would probably leave it a little bit loose until you finalize everything and try to put the engine cover on. That way you get as much adjustment as possible. Okay, so we're going to tighten these up. If you don't have AN wrenches, what we're showing you is without AN wrenches. This is adjustable. You can tighten them without doing anything. I would recommend maybe you put a rag around it just so that you don't mess up the finish on these, and then you can loosen this up to the point where you need it to, get that on, and then snug these up, and then do the same on the catch can itself. Okay, so these two pieces, this is a plug for if you have certain models, not this car because it doesn't have the different setup that you would find on a Golf R or an S3. TTS and TT would also likely be the same, as well as Quattro A3s. You plug the washer cap or the washer neck with this because you have to delete it where the catch can actually mounts on the engine mount. So they do have a relocation kit that is available separately. We will link to that in the description where you can find a relocation kit for that. But this is for if you're not using that particular setup. Okay, now we are going to snap this pipe back down on top of this inlet, and then we're going to reinstall our ignition coils and this duct here, and we're all set with our install. Okay, so question we've often had on this is, can you mount the factory engine cover? So you can see here, factory engine cover is mounted in place. The hoses go underneath of it. You could trim the engine cover if you wanted to mount some things, but we've had this engine cover on our other setup for a long period of time without any issues around the hoses. These are very sturdy hoses. I wouldn't expect to have any issues with chafing or anything like that, but if you did, you could always reroute them a little bit to give you a little more clearance. And you can see underneath there's some space still available underneath here. So if you want a video on how to empty your catch can, there is a dipstick here on checking it. We do have a video that we will link to in the description where you can check out how to empty it, and you've completed your install. Thanks so much for watching. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more like it.